Hello and welcome. I'm Deep Noetics, and you're listening to the first episode of Dual Aspects, my podcast with Dawson here. And Dawson is a philosopher and poet, a writer, and I am also a humble writer myself. But we approach topics from different perspectives, as my background is more in science, in engineering, and Dawson comes more from the poetic literary side. Thus, we are approaching the topics from dual aspects. Welcome, Dawson. Happy to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful that we could have this project that we've been planning for months to come to fruition. And I know that it will be fruitful as we approach it from different disciplines at the same time.
Right. Yeah, we what kind of brought us together was our joint interest in the idea of dual aspect monism, a concept that especially a man named Harald Atmanspacher, a German Swiss professor for philosophy and physics, has kind of brought to the fore, popularized, especially in his analysis or interpretation of the dialogues between Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung. Kind of in the spirit of this podcast, we are talking about the letter exchanges between a physicist and a psychoanalyst. So we're bringing the physical world and the psychic world, the mental and the material, together in a new way that is understood or referred to as dual aspect monism. So, Dawson, do you want to tell me about how you got to this topic? And then I'll tell you a bit about how I got to it.
Yes, absolutely. I was first introduced to this correspondence through your own recommendation over a year ago. And a few of my close friends, Clint, Nicholas, and Braden, they have all been studying Jung for many years. And one of them in particular thought it would be very beneficial to look at this correspondence. And so I started reading letters about Christmas time last year. And then I came to realize that Pauli brought these novel perspectives to Jung's own approach to dream interpretation. And I was fascinated that at first, Pauli was the patient of Jung. He sought him out for therapy. And as the correspondence says, there are hundreds of letters exchanged between them on just the interpretation of Pauli's dreams. And and then I was more impressed with Pauli in time is that he's very well read in philosophy. So for instance, he mentions Arthur Schopenhauer, also a personal influence, and he suggests to Jung that he read Arthur Schopenhauer, and he actually, this is something we'll talk about later, he says Schopenhauer anticipates this concept of synchronicity in his own essay. And I thought that was extraordinary to hear from a physicist introducing to Jung Schopenhauer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is a lot of overlap, I would say, with between Schopenhauer and Jung's entire conception of the psyche. So, Schopenhauer once said that when the Upanishads, the ancient Hindu texts, were translated and he got to read them, that it filled him with joy because they kind of confirmed everything he had written. So, in a way, how I conceptualize it, you have the big soul and the small soul. You've got Brahman and Atman, where kind of Atman is this kind of individualized, localized ego identity, and which, however, is merely kind of one aspect, one substructure of Brahman, of the eternal soul, something that goes beyond and something that encompasses the entire world to an extent. And without going too deep into Schopenhauer, there is a kind of correlation to be made with Jung's work where he doesn't really focus so much in this Freudian model of the id and the ego, but rather it's more about the ego and the self. And so the ego essentially is, you could say, an image or an idol of the self. And as it is always merely an image or an idol, it never entirely captures the self, but it is basically engaged through the process of individuation, of integrating it into the self. So a kind of a completed and individuated personality integrates their ego into the self by so-called shadow integration. So you could understand it in a certain way, which is perfectly outlined in Jung's work Aion. It's almost, you could say, his most fundamental work, even though it's not even close to being his earliest work, but it kind of goes back to, if you're a computer nerd, you could call it the BIOS, the fundamental system, the black screen with the white letters that runs before your operating system is launched. And that is this kind of separation of the ego and the self, and this idea where the shadow is a complex that is part of the self. It's part of the self, but it is not yet integrated into the ego. And once the shadow is integrated, it becomes a more coherent ego. But it's yet another ego. It's just kind of, you could say, transcended, or it has emerged onto a new kind of more coherent level. But in order for there to be a continuous process of individuation, you kind of need to have this kind of unattainable self. You need to have this kind of perpetual challenge, the perpetual task present at individuation. And going back to Pauli and his connection to Jung, we see a kind of correlation in their lives, in their own you could say fates towards and searches towards individuation, where the concepts that are most interesting for them begin to overlap. And for Pauli, it is specifically being one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics, it is the idea of the Pauli exclusion principle, which explains the exclusion of quantum particles in a given state. So, for example, no two particles can inhabit the exact same state. There is such a thing as an energy state, and then within each energy state, you have so-called spin states. So you can, very simplified, you can speak of a spin up and a spin down. And so if there's only these two states in a particular energy state, and you have two particles, then one of them necessarily has spin up and the other one necessarily has spin down. And if one of them gets switched, the other one is, you could say, automatically also switched into the other state. So you cannot flip the spin of one of these particles to inhabit the exact same state on the exact same energy state. Otherwise, these particles would not be distinguishable. You could not be speaking of two different states. So it goes deep into the idea of identity and how identity relates to epistemology and our ability to distinguish particles. But the spookiness about it, as generally the kind of spookiness that Einstein attributed to quantum mechanics, is this instantaneous ability to switch, or this ability of one particle to understand, using a bad metaphor here, to understand that it needs to be in a different state without there being any actual physical interaction between them. No kind of communication or kind of exchange of photons or other messenger particles. So you have a kind of instantaneous switch that is not causal. So there's a kind of acausal relationship there, an acausal meaningful relationship, which is essentially what the definition is for Carl Jung's synchronicity.
Yes, and so in the way that the particles don't meet, the dream, so to speak, the psychological dimension doesn't meet the physical world. And there's an attempt in dream interpretation to make the gap between the two, make it coherent. And this is something that Pauli is trying to elucidate by reading Jung's lectures And he says at one point in the correspondence, Pauly says, at Princeton, I had the opportunity to discuss your concept of synchronicity. I tried to explain to my audience. And at this point, I decided to use the term meaningful correspondence, as he thought it would be more fitting for this if you want to say, convergence between between the physical world and the psychic world, and the attempt to, I think, make your dream states or psychic phenomena more concrete is sort of the attempt by Pauly in studying his own dreams. And I think that this the perplexity comes from is that Jung himself is not a physicist, and he admits that he has little background, such as myself, in physics and mathematics. And so he he has Pauly introduce certain terms to him so that he can try to explain the psychic states from a physical level. And it doesn't always translate well. I think there's this constant challenge from both, is to make quantum mechanics more intelligible. And then there's an attempt to make, for Jung, to make the unconscious more comprehensive to those that are doing this analysis of their dreams. So I think that this is where the challenge comes, is trying to use their fields to elucidate the psychic phenomenon and the physical phenomenon, if we can say it that way.
Yeah, yeah. It also mirrors in a way, you could say, our kind of communication here, where my background will be way more rooted in kind of the mathematical and physical aspect. Though I have to say that I'm not specifically an expert on quantum mechanics. I mean, I have studied it, I have done some work in it, but like not close to any kind of you know, graduate, PhD graduate, or professor specified or specifically researching in quantum mechanics. However, I think there's many kind of collaborations, or you could say communications, between different kinds of thinkers, and if they're capable of kind of finding this common ground, even if the common ground is murky and not really well defined, it can lead to very, very productive exchanges. I have to think of the letter exchange of Werner Heisenberg, another famous founding father of quantum mechanics, and Martin Heidegger ahead of a Munich conference in the 50s. However, that one was somewhat interesting to read as kind of an anecdote, but not close to as fruitful as the exchange between Pauli and Jung. And so the difficulty in any of these talks, and you could almost say it is kind of this, I don't know, this eternal problem of reconciling the mental aspect and the physical aspect. I think the problem is that, you know, one always tends to fall into reductionism, into reducing one to the other that one temperamentally almost you know, prefers. You know, if your philosophical temperament, you could say, has a certain kind of tendency, and if we were kind of, let's say, stereotypical people in that sense, obviously my background in physics would kind of lead me towards attempting a sort of material reductionism, and potentially, if you were kind of a stereotypical philosopher or something of that kind, you would tend to kind of attempt to reduce it to spirit of some sort, some kind of idealism, and then we would kind of try and debate that out, right? And look at that. And this is, I would say, something that we really exactly want to avoid and need to avoid, and that is something Atmanspacher, with his dual aspect monism, really strove to avoid. And the way he conceptualizes it is, it's not either or, in the sense that you're trying to reduce one to the other. It's also not both, however. It's not the idea of kind of a, you know, you could call it a naive panpsychism or a naive pantheism, depending on how you conceptualize it, where everything is at once material and conscious. Everything is at once material and mental. So I think it is, in a sense, more differentiated, because yes, we cannot separate the mental and the material, as anyone going back as far as we can. Let's take Aristotle. If he speaks of the substance being composed of form and substrate, you can't ever separate them. There's always both. But we should also avoid having a sort of kind of isolated conception of what the mental is and an isolated conception of what the material is, and just kind of glue them together, which is kind of what you would see in a kind of naive dualism as well,
Yes.
right? Yeah, let me know what you think about
Yeah,
that.
avoiding the dualistic approach. And there's something that's, sort of leaping ahead, yet there's a notion of the Pauli effect, where he in his self had this moment where he was thinking about this vehicle outside of the cafe he was sitting in, and the vehicle sort of caught flame into flame. And this is, of course, many would say this is not possible, but for him, there was a convergence between prior dreams and his fear or his intuition about this vehicle, and then it catching fire and actually happening right before his eyes. And so this happened and at various occasions for Pauli. And you could say the more one becomes aware of their dreams, the more he may or may not have a proclivity to attribute meaning to our experiences in the waking life, if we prefer that term, in the phenomenal world. And so that those connections might become more apparent to us because of this. We're on this trajectory of dream interpretation, and we're concerned with how this is influencing us in our waking life. And so that it becomes more apparent to Jung as well, with his famous example of the scarab, if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is a very, very big and very expansive kind of topic. And just to kind of close off with and connect it to the idea of this dual aspect monism, is that it is precisely not both or either or, it is neither, right? It's the idea that the philosophical origin, or the foundational origin from which both aspects, the mental and the physical, originate from, that it is in its own essence neither of those. So in a sense, we are kind of, you could, to be critical, you could say that we are in a sense submitting to a kind of mysticism, but to kind of strengthen our point would mean that we are actually kind of being epistemologically humble and in a sense more rigorous, because we are admitting to the delineation kind of in a Kantian way of what we fundamentally have no access to. And so in that way, even this kind of limitation is almost a negative ontology. It can actually give us access based on what it abstains from revealing about itself. And this kind of, open curiosity, that is, I think, something that is necessary if you want to take dreams seriously at all. And you've brought up the Pauli effect. There was even labs that didn't want to let Pauli in, because as soon as he entered the lab, all of the machines would fail. So there is a kind of a meaningful coincidence, even though there's no real causality behind it. And there's been attempts at describing it. You've brought up Schopenhauer, and I think Jung refers to his idea of the meridian, that you have kind of a causality that's stems from the what's called the effect of your cause, but it's in a sense it contributes. You have an immediate causal chain that you can identify within a controlled framework, an experiment, a scientific theory, but in a sense, after a while, it kind of contributes to the overall kind of hum and wave of the general kind of happening, and there's no way of tracing it back anymore, right? There's no way. It's it just contributes to the general hum of the cosmos, the general kind of complex interconnection of general causality. And then within this, the meridian is kind of just this this wave that suddenly flushes onto shore these two very different events that suddenly are connected, that suddenly kind of end up on the same island, you could say, on the same island that gives us an insight into what is happening beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, right?
Yes, and this is one of the merits of Wolfgang Pauli as well. In the correspondence, he explicitly references an essay by Schopenhauer. If we wanted to look at it on the specific page, or I can just briefly say that this was Schopenhauer's concern, the union of necessity and pure chance. And there's a meeting point at a certain stage where pure chance meets necessity. And how do we explain that in the sense of Pauli walking into the labs and and having a direct influence on the results? This would be this that Schopenhauer already anticipated. This is according to Pauli, whom he quotes Schopenhauer, and then he directs Jung's attention to it. And this would be on page 37 in your copy. And
Okay.
yeah, this is very important because, as Pauli will say, and this is, I think, helpful for both of us, is that if concepts have already been elaborated by another thinker, it's always important to know who they are so that we can have reference to them, which fits in with this larger question of methodology with looking into the past, searching for symbols that correspond to my dreaming experiences, searching for thinkers who have already conceptualized something that could help elucidate my problem that I'm having with interpretation or with explaining natural phenomena. So with Pauli, he refers to Renaissance thinkers, the Platonists like Pico di Mirandola and Ficino, who he says they understood eros in a way that today we have lost access to, of thinking of, broadly speaking, love and something metaphysical rather than something that is purely physiological. And with these letters, Pauli is extremely nimble-minded. He will be referring to something that for him is very comprehensive in his field of quantum mechanics or his recent researches. And then he'll refer to Ficino's letters on Plato's Symposium and the concept of eros. So reading Pauli's letters is really a demanding task because he's requiring that we look throughout antiquity and throughout various fields at the same exact moment. So this is why I was so fascinated with him.
Yeah, I mean, it really goes to show as well the sheer level of kind of general education that some of these scientists and academics had at the time. Especially, we have to remember it was a time where you could basically know all of the people working on quantum mechanics. You could basically meet them all, and there was no peer review. There was no kind of red tape and kind of what's it called, citation dominated academia, which you could say really has stalled, and I think there's even studies on it, stalled the kind of amount of groundbreaking results and research coming out, because the safety mechanism to avoid science devolving into kookery and pseudoscience has kind of led to an increased conformity, you could say, a conformity that, you know, in order to get through peer review, you kind of have to satisfy your peers to a certain extent, right? And you know, what Einstein could do, because he was Einstein and he lived quite some time ago, was as soon as someone, you know, returned his paper with edits after peer review, he just kind of was appalled by that, you know, about that behavior and about this impudence, and just left and published somewhere else, right? And obviously there would always be someone that would allow Einstein to just publish whatever he likes, but this is not really possible anymore. And so we have this difficulty if there's a particular, you could say, conundrum that hasn't been resolved, a kind of an antinomy that hasn't been resolved since then. It's gotten harder to resolve it because we've kind of established an academic system that maintains or makes it inflexible to to go back to those prior assumptions, even if those prior assumptions are the contributing factor to the kind of stalling of progress or stalling of new discoveries in a particular area. And I think that's the best example of it is this whole question of the interpretation of quantum mechanics, the so-called collapse of the wave function. And that is something that has, you could say that there's been work done on it, and there's been a lot of exciting work done on it, but it's not like it's broken through to something new, essentially. We still kind of work with this so-called Copenhagen interpretation that was brought up by Niels Bohr and Heisenberg. And, there's new interpretations. I think the most popular one after that is this many worlds idea, the many worlds interpretation, which, people can think of it what they like, but it's also not something that necessarily is a source for a lot of new ideas or new kind of ways of researching quantum mechanics, new ideas of developing new theories. It's been very limited in its impact when it comes to that. And obviously there's other philosophical problems, especially if you're a fan of Occam's razor and don't want an infinity or near infinity of universes popping up every picosecond that you cannot really interface with, then obviously it feels like mental baggage, a lot of mental baggage, these kind of theories, right? And so, yeah, you're basically left with still this kind of question of the collapse of the wave function, because essentially the collapse of a wave function is the collapse of a theory, a mental model of the world, into its physical instantiation. It is basically a kind of, we have this gap that hasn't been bridged sufficiently, and the collapse is basically a real world example of this gap being kind of crushed in an instance where we need it to be bridged, right? And this is something we don't fully understand, as this gap needs to be somewhere. It needs to be in some common space in which the mental and the physical can encounter each other. But what is this space made of? Is it made of, this kind of both physical and mental space of infinite universes, where every possible universe of our mental space is also a physical universe in some alternative space? Or is it what Atmanspacher has been talking about, which I would argue, and it's neither. It's neither nor. It's something else, and that something else we are only at the very beginning of exploring.
And this is a major problem for interpretation, is that we don't have adequate language criteria that could help explain the phenomena, so that we or physicists or philosophers are inclined to create concepts which could very much be pseudo concepts, like the notion of the ether, as it has been passed down until it was largely refuted. It was always sort of this like you said, working within, going back to Kant, within the noumena, within sort of the area beyond sensation, is that we would create a concept that would attempt to explain what we don't know. So we have it, we posit it. This is the ether, or this is the phlogiston theory. It was yes, and it was until recently. So this is an attempt made to make it comprehensive, even though there's no direct apprehension of it. And this is a problem that has been at the behest of physicists since quantum mechanics, right? Because we're dealing with quanta of energy, which is not physically apprehended. In the sense of, at least me, I don't have the ability to intuit it. Yeah. And I have to take it for granted.
Yeah, and I think the problem in a sense is older than we think, and there has been attempts at resolving it that have been kind of dismissed as pre-scientific or pseudoscientific solutions. And I think this is where Jung's true strength comes in, because he's a real scholar in the true sense of the word, of ancient text, alchemical text, medieval text. He really traces a tradition. He's really, you could say, as Terence McKenna referred to it, a noetic archaeologist. Someone who actually studies the caves of the
Yeah.
ancient parts of our psyche. And that's where he kind of split with Freud, where he literally had a dream where they were exploring an old basement, and Freud was just kind of cataloging what's in the basement, but Jung was like, hey, look, there's like old bones lying there, and behind it there's like another whole labyrinth, a whole like maze, tunnel system, whatever. But Freud is not interested in that. But that is kind of the whole thing, that the kind of, the meridians of the past, the meridians of causality that are deeply ancient, that we cannot trace anymore in its particulars, but that somehow leave its impact, its imprint through the larger waves. That is something that is not only kind of truly, a truly noble philosophical pursuit, but it is actually deeply scientific, I would argue, as well. It is very clear that evolution, for example, and evolutionary development builds on archaic systems. It's kind of very conservative in a way, because most innovations fail. So it kind of has inbuilt mechanisms of working with what is functional, and that applies not just to a kind of a material biological substructure, but it applies to this entire complex network of, our thoughts, our interactions with the environment, our interactions with each other through language and through various forms of engagement with the world, and its back reaction and feedback onto our own biology, right? And this is where I think this is where this kind of idea of the archetype is particularly fruitful. And this is
Yes.
where I would also say the scientific framework emerges from the archetypal idea of the alchemist, the kind of the alchemist is where Jung got his like unus mundus, or the Ouroboros, the snake biting its own tail, this kind of intertwined aspect, intertwined non-dual entity that only then separates into its kind of mental and material property. And the alchemists still tried to kind of tie them together. They still tried to find a connection between Mercury and the planet Mercury, right? And also the spiritual properties of the mercurial spirit of Mercury as Hermes, as this kind of ancient figure, ancient archetypal deity. And this is right. This is kind of where we have to admit there is this mystery of quantum mechanics is much older. It has actually always been there in science, and that is this mystery of how come our mental models map onto the real world. How come we can actually use this faculty, this strange faculty that can just kind of grab aspects of the world. Hegel literally calls it Begriff, as the German word for concept, but also a kind of, you could say, a play on words of a Griff meaning a grasp, a Begriff, the act, the concept as a verb, as an action of grasping, of grabbing the material world and putting it into something that kind of forms and shapes it. That is actually deeply alchemical, you could say.
Yeah, that our epistemological framework can correspond to the phenomenal world, and that there can be a correspondence, and for it to be cohesive. And this is something of which the philosophy of alchemy, if we can call it that, is the search for a cohesion between the older notions, say, of the gods with the material elements. And so just the philosophy of alchemy has an enduring quality about it, is that each epoch is concerned with this meeting of the material with the concepts that have been passed down to it. And so this is in the grandiose sense, Jung, and not unlike Thomas S. Kuhn closely thereafter, is attempting to look into the history of ideas as a way to find correspondence with the psychological and the physics of our own time. And the more one is conversant with the ancient authorities, the more they might actually find out that the dilemmas are not so novel as they appear to be. As you have said, this search for the mysteries of quantum mechanics has a genealogy, as you're saying, as it were, archaeology to it. And this is why cross-fertilization is important. And this is essentially why I'm always searching through new disciplines in order to find corresponding discourse that helps elucidate this. And Jung is a proponent of that. And people with humanistic education, in quotes, like Wolfgang Pauli, that was essentially a rite of passage until very recently. They were able to make these connections, and they weren't far-fetched because they could have correspondence with their colleague, as he did with Heisenberg and Niels Bohr and Einstein and Weinberg and more, and they could actually help clarify these concepts together because they were able to have a body of literature that they've all read and they take seriously. Like Einstein said, if I hadn't read Spinoza or Kant or Schopenhauer, I wouldn't really have become a physicist. So I think this is, for me or for you, this is something that we take for granted, or we don't take it for granted. We already know it to be valuable, so it's hard to translate it to those that are hyper specialized, because within our friends at academic institutes, they're hyper specialized at times that limits their ability to elucidate the problems in their fields. So if they have a problem in physics, they don't go looking through psychology or philosophy, unless they're a philosopher of science or they're, open-minded. And so it's actually, the cure can be very simple. It could just be, you should read someone from philosophy or someone from psychology, or you should read history in order to help elucidate your problem. Because Thomas S. Kuhn did that. He started off with this, how do I explain the break from Aristotle's physics? Well, I have to go back to Galileo. And then from there, I have to go into history. And then he started reading Kant. And he went from physics to history to philosophy. And then he understood this notion of our prejudices of our time are shaped by the paradigm, which is much the framework, as you said, of epistemology. And if you can see that the prejudices of your own time, then you might make the leap out of the literature of your day, peer review, into something more dynamic, if I can put it that way, which leads you to the alchemical tradition or to philosophy. And this is essentially the project I would like to see on a large scale, that we have correspondence between different disciplines in order to not just solve the puzzles, but to actually understand the larger the influences that are shaping our ideas, which you could say is the unconscious, in a sense, in the domain of psychology.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's actually like, you could say that it could be more accurate to say, instead of a dual aspect monism, it's a multi-aspect monism, right? It's kind of a it is kind of a unity. We have to work with the assumption that there is some form of unity, and I feel like any kind of attempt to break with that leads to kind of nonsense or the kind of absurdity eventually. Like there are kind of brave and interesting thinkers. You could say there's parts of Nietzsche that has gone that way. There's like Camus and people like that. That kind of try and kind of let go of any kind of attachment to some sort of fundamental truth or fundamental unity. But I feel like it is, in a sense, archetypal. It is something that we are almost like wired to work with, that we cannot go without, that we cannot do without. We have to always, at least at a base instinctual level, assume there is a kind of unified reality we are engaging with, that we are engaging in. And the issue with that is obviously that this can very quickly become dogmatic. This can very easily become some sort of kind of materialistic. And I would say our paradigm today, if we speak with paradigms in terms of Kuhn, is not necessarily that it's materialistic. It's almost kind of like these two forms, the materialism and the mentalism, or the spiritualism. They've kind of become technologized. They've kind of, the technology is not a pure materialism. It is a kind of a specific way in which the material and the mental relate to each other. And in our current age, it is the way of computation. Like computation is not just hardware, it's obviously also software. What is software? Software, when we speak of software, we don't reduce it to the hardware. We don't, like, if I'm explaining a software, I'm explaining it with an ontology that assumes that the software is real, that it is a thing. I don't explain it by always referring back to the transistors operating to make it function, or to the semiconductors that the transistors are made of, or the electrons and the semiconductors, whatever. I don't kind of explain any software any better if I kind of refer it back to the transistors or the hardware. So essentially, we do have a kind of ontology or a way of thinking about things that has this kind of assumption of a reality of the mental when it comes to software, but it is stuck in a kind of technologized paradigm, a paradigm where the software and the hardware must follow certain rules, and these rules have become so all-encompassing that we cannot think outside of them any longer. Or most of us can't. I would say the notion that we can speak of it as something in itself is already a sign of a turning, as a sign of something of a reflection or an inflection point. And even within this logic, they are identifying an inflection point. They're just calling it like the singularity, or some kind of like point toward which technology accelerates. But it forces us to look in the mirror, in a sense, into the rear view mirror, and look at different conceptions of how we conceived of the world, how we understood being. In a way, we cannot avoid kind of referring back to Heidegger and the Seinsgeschichte, the history of being, and Seinsverständnis, the understanding of being. That there was obviously something fundamentally other about how they understood the gods and their relationship to the material world than what we have today. There was a fundamentally different, that we cannot directly access in a way, but we need to, it is again this monism, this unknown monism that we cannot define, we cannot grasp, yet we can actually gain some sort of insight and gain some sort of advantage through understanding that we cannot access this monism, yet it is there. And in the same way, we have this kind of way of being, this mode of being that predated our way of thinking of the world, that we know was different, that we know was other, yet we have no access to it. But this knowledge in itself has implications that will help us.
Yes, and the epochs of being, so the Greek way of being and the medieval way of being and the more modern, just to use the three examples, at least three of the examples that Heidegger refers to, is that we know them by way of the trace they have left, in a sense. By analogy, we know ancient civilizations through the architecture. It's a physical representation of their sense of being. Especially with Heidegger, the Greek way of being can be known through the temple, if you like.
Yeah,
and especially
it's their meridian, you could say.
Yes,
Yeah.
and their meridian. So one might ask, if we wanted to make sort of a leap, how are the meridians of consciousness left, and can they be accessed? For Jung and for Pauli, perhaps that this is true. You can access them through way of. I think it's. I don't know if there's a term they use specifically. It's not merely reading or hermeneutics. It's having read the material and then letting it influencing you in unconscious ways. So that, for instance, if I've been reading Wolfgang Pauli and Jung for a week, and I'm now walking down the street, and the idea enters me, so to speak, mystically speaking, it's now taking shape. It's now actively influencing me, and it almost has to be. You have to come at it by way of integration into your own psyche, your own unconscious, and then you start to grasp it in this sense of Hegel. You're beginning to grasp it now, and you know what the implications are. But until then, it's very difficult to translate. Say, we know the Greek way of being. We can read Aristotle and we can read Plato, and for us that are into literature and to reading, we would say, yeah, we can access their knowledge. And it's difficult now in our age because what's given is that it's a technological age. So already the medium of print doesn't have the priority of the medium of the laptop and the medium of electronic technology. And so, as you said, with the rearview mirror from McLuhan, those of us that are looking in the rearview mirror, not just purely because we have no choice, it's like we've been confronted with this limitation now. So now we want to go back. We're nostalgic, which is unfortunately most end up becoming in the rearview mirror looking because of nostalgia. No, we're doing it already because we're looking at the media, the evolution of the media. So print has left us traces of knowledge that we can still apprehend and access if we do the reading. And that's at least the catalyst to potentially transforming our way of thinking. We have to be willing to do the work. And this is something that is very, very much lost in our time. We know this from our own experience. To be a reader is sort of like to be a useful, to be an idiot. They say like private person is an idiot in the older sense of the word. Someone that has like a private relationship to this body of literature, which sounds kind of quasi mystical. You know, I have access to the Greeks. I've read Heidegger, and it doesn't have the validity for someone that hasn't looked into that medium. And I think this is where it becomes difficult to convey of having access to knowledge through texts, something that Jung was very much a proponent of, quoting the Hermetic tradition, quoting the works of John Dee, quoting Paracelsus, Robert Flood is another one, and so he posits that they have access to something we no longer have access to, yet we could if we're able to give it proper analysis.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think another aspect is even if you are a reader, we are living in an age of such information explosion and oversaturation that information, like the past, is like insanely far away for us, particularly far away for us, because time seems to be moving much faster, especially in terms of information and the development of information and the kind of cycling of new ideas and thoughts. Yet we seem to be caged in a way. Like that, all even though it's accelerated, it seems to be even more homogenized. It's this paradox that also leads us to conspiratorial thinking, of that
Mm.
that it's kind of like the media is caging us into something, despite it becoming ever more powerful and with each generation producing much more content. So there's probably every second there's more stuff being generated and produced than any one of us could read in their whole lifetime, and that makes it impossible to prioritize, which in one hand makes puts the past at a further and further distance, because everything that is developed now will be already pretty old and historical in 10 years. And we already have that with the computer screens, with the huge computer screens and the old PCs, what they looked like in the 90s. And the 90s are really not that far away, but it was already like a different world, a different age. And so yeah, this kind of makes this task more difficult, but at the same time, it makes the ancients ever more mystical, and you could say in modern terms it increases their aura in a sense, because
Yeah.
we going back that far, we don't have that much choice. We have this enormous amount of selection and choice right now, but the further back we go, the smaller it gets. And then suddenly it's like, okay, we come to a point and we only have Plato, Aristotle, and a couple others. And suddenly, contrasted to the amount we have today, these suddenly seem even more valuable than they would have in the past.
I think that's beautifully stated, and all the more reason to, well, if we take this as a personal judgment, we say that the value of the ancients is such that we should be reading them in order to help elucidate our contemporary problems. We'd have to either have read them long enough to know that, or have this sort of, in a good sense, naive notion that the ancients are authorities that we need to consult. even not having read them. So for people that we know, friends we have, other scholars, they know that the ancients have authority, if that's a word you would prefer, or they have coherency for us today, and the concepts are applicable to us because we still are the same. We still have the same psyche. We're still human, even though our material conditions have changed. And this is perhaps why Jung and Pauli again are important. Is that the material conditions have altered, yet accessing these uncanny regions of thinking remains the same, so that we can empathize with a scholar or a great thinker or a proto scientist in order to understand the contemporary scientific problems that we're facing. So that's why we reach back to Paracelsus and we go to Pseudo-Dionysus in order to help make the contemporary problem actually less novel, in order for it to be, I don't know, solved isn't, we're not trying to solve it. It's not static. It's a elucidating, I use the word again, to make it clear, or to show the implications, but not to just to solve the problem of indefinitely, because it's endless in its profusion. It's not fixed. It doesn't end. This is something, the stream of experiences, if you like, by analogy, is something that you can't stop. Uh, so for me, it's not a problem that there's no end to this pursuit of inquiry, or the scientific problems, or the history of the unconscious. The fact that it is so nebulous is all the more reason to understand it. And with our technological age, we can access it actually in, perhaps like you were saying, more ways than ever. Leaves open the possibility.
Yes, and I would say the purpose of it. I think the purpose of it becomes more interesting and more pressing because
Mm.
the connection, and that is this kind of almost empty but also at the same time, you know, fulfilling term of meaning, this correspondence of the mental and the physical in Pauline Jung. That correspondence is defined as meaning, or they're connected by meaning, as Atmanspacher also speaks about it, and they are kind of understanding meaning in a universalized way, you know. Okay, I'm still okay. I was frozen for a sec, but they understand meaning as you could say a, a global function. So
Yes.
there is this kind of significance between one entity and another. One refers to the other. In German, you would call that Bedeutung. But then there's
Mm.
Sinn, there's deep meaning.
Yes.
There is this meaning that actually connects or puts it into a cosmic context, you could say. And this is essentially what we're doing when connecting the mental and the material, is we are actually kind of seeking purpose. We're seeking this reconnection, and you could almost say it's a reconnection back to Aristotelian principles, where causality was a fourfold. And this is something that you know, we encounter again and again with Jung, is the fourfold aspect, where you have kind of the material. You've got matter and energy, but then you've got causality and synchronicity. It's like two orthogonal axes, where
Mm.
synchronicity is the counterpart to causality. You have the quaternity in the dreams of Jung. You've got
Yes.
the Geviert, the fourfold of Heidegger. So
Yes.
we're looking at a quaternity as well as the quaternity of the four causes in Aristotle. And in a way, we are bringing them together. We are bringing the material and the mental together so that they can rejoin with kind of the telos, with the purpose, um, the purposeful, the meaningful connections between the two. And essentially, what synchronicity is actually it's a sudden burst. I mean, the experience of synchronicity, the way we experience it, it's a sudden burst of meaning. And this is exactly how, and this helps us unlock the riddle of how clairvoyance or the oracles functioned. Why was the oracle such an important aspect of ancient man? Was it, obviously one way of looking at it is it was superstition. We have much better ways of dealing with problems technologically nowadays, but it still doesn't really explain the meaning. It doesn't explain the meaning, the purpose of the oracle, right? And the oracle is obviously something that is in tune with the meridian. It is in tune with something that you cannot capture by collecting facts, because there are always too many facts. It is something that you attune to by understanding, for example, art, for understanding dreams, understanding this kind of dream world that is expressed through art. And that is something Jung was capable of, and that was something any kind of great clairvoyant, any kind of great prophet was capable of. And the prophet would see points where there is kind of different layers. We have the little soul correspondence, the little soul synchronicity, where an individual dream corresponds with something that happens in daily life. But then there's also the Brahma, the big soul synchronicity, where you have the eons, the eonic events, the major transitions in our history that are, regardless of how we look at them from our current age, have shaped us and have basically, have generated a meridian that cannot be reversed. So, for example, the arrival of Christ, the kind of the emergence of Christianity, which, even if you are a complete materialist atheist and you reject all of the doctrines of Christianity, you cannot deny its historical impact and its major role in shaping our society, the way we think, and even our atheism, you could say, as a rejection to it. You could almost say, in a provocative way, that the atheists kind of they plagiarized their beliefs from Christ when he was on the cross, asking God why he'd forsaken him, right? Or they're basically kind of they're disciples of the 3 days in which there was no God, right? But yeah, that's what I'm. So essentially, the major synchronicity, the major eon that we're approaching, is this kind of mysterious singularity, this convergence happening, this kind of the convergence of technology that we're looking at. And the job of the prophets, of the oracles, is to actually contextualize it into this kind of meaningful interrelating web of sense in our cosmos. Whereas our current framework, or from within the technological framework that's bringing it about, it's not understandable. It's just kind of like, okay, and anyone who's serious about it, anyone who's honest about it, will just kind of admit that it's like, okay, we're just kind of like annihilating the human race. We're just kind of, anyone who's honest about it is just kind of like, we're destroying existence. It's like, okay, wait, we don't want that.
There's discontinuity between our history and the futurity. In that sense, we clearly, or some would say clearly, don't know what the major innovation will be in 10 years from now. We only know that it's going to be incommensurate with our past. We know that very much. So, for instance, we know that the technological world will reshape the human body. The technology will reshape physiology in a way that's incommensurate with all prior epochs. So this gives it some degree of novelty and even auspicious quality about it. So someone can live in this uncertainty. They could essentially adopt that position that the unforeseeable is what is ahead. And perhaps they're not even searching for teleology, what the purpose might be, or they're not concerned with coherency in the disciplines of the natural sciences and the humanities. So already, someone that has this interest in coherency, they're inclined to want to make the connections between the disciplines, in some senses, to have coherency when there is none in the future, with this incommensurability that is ahead of us. I would think that it would be naive to say that the reshaping of the human body, to quote J.G. Ballard from his novel Crash. He wrote the book Crash, which was adapted by David Cronenberg into a very explicit film, which I recommend to some people. Some might not like it.
Doesn't
He
Baudrillard
said,
speak of it in
yes,
Simulacra and in Simulation?
he writes an essay about it. Extremely graphic. It's the melding of technology with the body in an irreversible way. And this is something that we know from at least the way people are interacting with the world of the internet. It's become where the world of the internet influences and shapes their dreams and their waking life in ways that are more profound or more significant, in ways that they might be shaped by interactions with people or interactions in nature. Those have taken, in some cases, secondary or third role of significance to how their mind is shaped, which is through the medium of technology at all times. So that's something that you can't step outside of. However, if you're interested in some sort of rational guiding principle navigating through the sea of technology, then the history of philosophy and then the history of psychology would be the guiding threads. Like the word I like from Sanskrit, sutra, which means guiding thread. And these texts that the Hindus, for instance, gave us, and the Buddhists, the sutras, the guiding threads, they have efficacy across generation, across time. They don't lose their efficacy. Even if it was written by Nagarjuna or Siddhartha, they still are guiding threads for practitioners. So they're as you said, outside of time. And this is something which I've discovered through my readings, is these texts have the ability to be guiding threads regardless of the circumstances. And this is something that comes from a routine engagement with the wisdom traditions, as some would call it. And the more I dive into Jung, the more I want to dive into further the alchemical tradition and ancient sources, like we've discussed before together, back to Egypt, for instance, and seeing where their innovations and where their customs have direct implications for us now. Just
Right.
just part of
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's obviously an endless rabbit hole to get into, but like endlessly fruitful. I'm sure. I mean, it is like it is, again, something that's mirrored in the process of modern science is just this attempt to drill down to something eternal, drill
Mhm.
down to kind of remove all the layers of deceit and illusion and kind of material randomness to arrive at this kind of pure unity of the physical law, the law of the universe, the one principle. And it is something that still guides modern science. I mean, physics has been obsessed with this idea, or a lot of, at least popular, how physics is popularly conveyed, has been obsessed with this pursuit of a theory of everything, of
Yes.
this idea of finding a model for the Big Bang and the universe, of a complete universal cosmology. This is a deeply, spiritual pursuit. This is a deeply religious pursuit. And in a way, it is a deeply Luciferian pursuit, you could say, or
Mhm.
Faustian pursuit of our age. Something that is characterized by this idea that our reason, our faculties of reason, they can dominate and they can reign supreme in the universe. And that is something where you could say, okay, this pursuit of truth, this pursuit of the eternal universality, that is kind of eternal in the sense, like everything eternal is eternal. It's kind of a tautology, but that is eternal. Whereas what is recent, or what is something within time, is this kind of Faustian aspect of it, is this kind of attempt to dominate, in a sense, the entire cosmos by kind of subjugating it into a mathematical formula. And what it is in the end is it is in the end actually this kind of it hides a kind of nihilism. It actually hides a kind of disrespect to the monism, to the mystery of that monism, and thus actually results in the exact kind of absurdity and nihilism I spoke of in the very beginning. It is actually a kind of you could say, an absurd phenomenon, an absurd endeavor, to kind of have this Big Bang model of the universe, because there's no practical implication, there's no technology we can build on it. Even if we develop our machines and whatnot, it'll take 100,000 million years. Like, nothing of any kind of real consequence that actually conveys any kind of mastery of the cosmos by us can be built or created out of this. It is just a pure kind of proof of kind of, in a sense, rational supremacy, or the supremacy of our faculties of reason and rationality. And that is something that has become dangerous, and is increasingly becoming more and more dangerous, as we can see with the continuous kind of global fallout of our own scientific world and our own technologized world, whether it is in environmental terms or it is in things like, the pandemic, things like that. And so, in a sense, this kind of noetic archaeology that we're engaging in, that we're trying to kind of uncover these more fundamentals, and even if we're uncovering them in our dreams, finding the archetypes that are beyond temporal, beyond time, that is something that is necessary, even if in a few years, when this is developed into something more concrete, into something more elaborate, we may look back on it and think it's rather silly, or find our initial attempts and practices rather silly. But it's just kind of a first attempt of marching into a uncharted terrain, and we are bound to make mistakes and seem silly afterwards, and perhaps it'll seem ridiculous to have even analyzed our dreams in the first place. Who knows? But it is a start into a new direction that hasn't been explored much.
Absolutely. And it also, at a certain point, it has a very idiosyncratic aspect to it. So my dream interpretation only has ramifications for me. I'm attempting to try to integrate it into my own complexes and my past. And then if it has implications beyond me, it's not only unexpected, it's kind of an anomaly in a sense. This is
Right.
this is the upshot. So then when you find out that there are symbols from the past that might correspond to dreams you've had, then you start to feel that it has a deeper meaning. And then it can be again, catalysts to research. For me, the catalyst to engaging more with physics is via your own work and via Wolfgang Pauli and Thomas S. Kuhn and Feyerabend. So now it's for me, through time, to essentially bring out all the implications from that. So a lot of inquiry, I like to link it to, again, the concept of the daimon, which is in keeping with the Greeks. The Christian tradition has its own understanding of what that means. Goethe was very, very keen on
Daimon, what was the
emphasizing just the daimon, but the
Daimon?
Christian tradition is, the inner spirit, the inner voice, the daimonic. And this is what Socrates said he followed most of his life. And it takes you, initially it's intelligible. You need to study physics, for example, you need to study psychology. However, the conclusion, or what the teleology is, the purpose, remains to be seen. And that's why you have to go through years of roaming through the desert, roaming through the unconscious, in order to decide and to make the picture clearer to you. So it's interesting, is this kind of analysis has always at least two benefits. It's meaningful to you, and then it's meaningful to how you can actually demonstrate your knowledge to others. And then you open up the possibility for the other person, the friend, to engage in a discourse with you, which will introduce them to novel ways of thinking. Because this cognitive pursuit isn't just purely self-satisfactory.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah,
like the equation problem. He said the link to limit everything to one equation, like Max Planck says, we're searching for that one equation so we can know everything, the principle of everything. And Heidegger quotes it in his lectures. Max Planck says this is one of the unfortunate nightmares of modern physics, which Max Planck was not necessarily, a proponent of. He was saying this is where it's going. He has a great text, right, on science and where it's going. Of I miss these days where these physicists were so philosophically inclined, trying
yeah.
to forecast. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It has gotten rare. I mean, there's some interesting ones you can look at, like Roger Penrose. I'm personally a Penrose enthusiast, a Penrose fan. I think Atmanspacher is personally friends with him. Um,
Great.
yeah, makes me very jealous. And, yeah,
They-
I mean, but like it doesn't, in my view, go much beyond Atmanspacher and Penrose. I think there was some interesting stuff I've read by Carlo Rovelli here and there.
yes, five lessons.
There's Friedrich Capra, who did some interesting kind of the
Oh yes,
Tao of physics stuff.
physics.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, but yeah, you're right. I miss those days as well. And just to kind of go back to your notion of the daemon and these kind of connections, the personal connections, and how they connect to more objective things, I can bring up a kind of personal anecdote there. I have actually spent a lot of time journaling my dreams, and then once I had a lot of dreams, I kind of tried to distill the essence out of it, kind of um, find common themes that are reoccurring across dreams, and themes that would maybe link back to my childhood. And so there was this idea in a lot of my dreams. A recurring theme was a kind of mountain, a central mountain. It was like the mountain of all mountains, or like it would sometimes appear as a kind of a greenish volcano that would have some sort of sound or harmony, almost like there's some instrument at the center of the world that kind of blows its tunes out of the top of that volcano. Um, but I traced it back, and I found also, like, me as a child, I used to like drawing maps. I used to like drawing fantasy maps of fantastical areas. I was a fan of fantasy novels, and so depending on what fantasy novel I was reading at the time, the map would kind of have that style. You can really see a Tolkien phase of me drawing very Lord of the Rings like maps. But there was two of them I still have. I think there was more, but I may have lost others. But two of them that actually had this island with the central mountain in the middle. And then I kind of like did some research, and I found this idea of Mount Meru, or also Hara Bere Zaiti. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. A mythical mountain in the Zoroastrian tradition. It was kind of the mountain that spawned all other mountains. It was almost, in some traditions, some say they have identified a physical mountain in modern day Iran, but others say it was always meant to have been only kind of a mythical, spiritual, like a holy mountain, Khodorovsky's terms, that was just kind of the ancestor of all mountains, of all kind of and mountains as places, like, you can't just say mountain as the physical object that is in some mountain range. Mountain as the meaningful, elevation of man's spirit. It's something that people went up to worship, to sacrifice. Moses went on top of a mountain to get the commandments, and so, like, there is a esoteric meaning to Hara Bere Zaiti. And so, like, what are we looking at here? It's unclear. It's now unclear, because, like, am I kind of like building up some kind of, narrative in my head? Am I living in some narrative in my head, and I'm just kind of like, creating it in my head to around myself to make my life more interesting? Or am I tapping into some ancestral memory? Am I tapping into, is there some kind of archetype that I am engaging with, that I'm encountering, that others have, such as, these traditions? And is it something ancestral, as I literally have, ancestry and blood memory from the region of the former Persian Empire, right? So, obviously something that we can't really, or I can't really answer right now. And perhaps, this kind of research, this kind of area of study will develop and evolve and look very differently in some years' time.
Well, there's a point at which you submit to your findings. You can't qualify it, and that your dreams may have been indicating that you needed to research into this history of what is in the Native American tribes called Mount Katahdin. It's something that Henry David Thoreau talked about. He was engaged with the tribe in near Concord in Massachusetts, and Mount Katahdin translates to high place. A lot of the mountains by the tribes indicated it meant high place. So it meant you would go there for worship, like Delphi, like Moses, in order to gain perspective, which you couldn't have at the lower levels. And then if you're really given into this analysis, like Jung and Pauli, then you would be looking for, okay, what does this indicate? From the lowest point to the highest point, what does this have as implications for my own integrated psyche? And then you would extrapolate from these interpretations of your dreams into something that was coherent and comprehensive. So you submit to these researches in this sense, and that you have no idea where it's leading you. And so there's a degree of humility that comes from these from studying physics and philosophy, is you know that you don't know. If we are truly Socratic, we admit to the fact that we don't know, and we know that there's a larger region of the unknowable than there is the knowable, of which we inhabit now, which is extremely provincial. And so these analyses that go into the subterranean level, as you said at the beginning, we have to go to the subterranean level and then do an excavation of that, and then be willing to do so while not having any certainty of where it's heading us. So some physicists, some philosophers have submitted to this. Kierkegaard, in a different context, talks about objective uncertainty, and this is something I've thought was phenomenal. So you admit that you don't know, and in his context, you submit to your faith as being a Christian. It's an objective uncertainty. So I've always thought that was a very good principle of humility, and largely the domain of now the quantum level and the level of the history of consciousness is unknowable, and perhaps we won't inhabit most of it in our own lifetime. We have to admit to that.
Yeah, entirely. And often all we can get is like a glimpse of where a transformation or transition happened from the unknowable into the knowable. But we can't really go further back than that. So, for example, if we look at the mythical of these ideas of how people understood the oracles, there is a kind of a veil in front of it, because the only way we know about them is through people who already had moved on to, or were already on the way to move on to a new paradigm. For example, there is a fragment of Pythagoras where he's asked about what is the Oracle of Delphi. And he says it's the Tetrakis, again, a quaternity. The Tetrakis is this famous pyramid of like a single dot at the top, or a single element at the top, then 2, then 3, then 4. This kind of triangle made of that. And you see this diffusing. This has caused its own meridian diffusing into Hermeticism, which interfaced with Jewish mysticism, and you have this exact Tetrakis then depicted in this kind of symbol of Yod He Vav, and Yod He Vav He, of the Tetragrammaton, again a quaternity of the 4 letters describing God, describing Yahweh. Which is just a kind of a creation of Pythagoras' Tetrakis. But like, what does that even tell us about the Oracle of Delphi? How does that even explain it to us? So it's like there's already something lost, because our oldest sources, are people that were already transitioning into a new paradigm. Auguste Comte speaks of it as a transition from the mythical to the metaphysical, and then later to what he advocated for as the positivist. But if we actually had gone full positivist, and if he's correct, then so much would have been lost about the metaphysical. If we were just kind of to know what the positivist was to say, about things and to say about previous stages, we would lose a lot of what the metaphysical really entailed. And it's the same here. We at best understand the mythical through sources that were already semi-metaphysical, right? Because they were already writing about it, and they were already, because, how would you realistically, as someone like Hesiod, how would you
Mm.
realistically capture the myths if like every village has a different version of them, a different narration of them, and like they have different names for the same gods, and some of the gods are gods for one thing, some of the others, some overlap, some contradict. And how would you bring order into this? He already had to force himself to engage with some sort of metaphysics, with some sort of spiritual structuring, and forcing the myth into some sort of order. Um, and I'm obviously I'm doing the same if I'm looking at my dreams. I'm looking at people like Iamblichus, who
Mm.
differentiated. You mentioned the daemon, differentiated the immortal entities between the archons and the daemons. And I'm doing the same. I'm like, okay, how do I call the entities in my dreams that directly engage with me and are very kind of emotionally charged? And how do I deal with those entities that barely interact with me and they seem like the gatekeepers, the guardians, the kind of people that are only there to keep the dimensions and the fabric of reality in place, but don't really engage within them. I guess they're like the archons, but I mean, we're kind of you know um, forced to deal with these kind of unknowns by making use of established knowledge that has already distorted it to some extent.
Yeah, we have distortions and we've inherited that knowledge. And to the degree we're conscientious of it, because most of it is indirectly influencing us, as you're saying, the way that even a hardened positivist at the turn of the century, someone like Rudolf Carnap, after Ernst Mach, that accepted only empirically verifiable statements are true statements. So that's why metaphysics and even mostly aesthetics, even questions about ethics have to be removed from the discourse of the positivists. Because if it's not empirically verifiable, it's not part of the framework. It's not accepted. Well, this is only applicable and useful to very limited domains of knowledge, or perhaps just natural science, but not any other domain. So in this sense, the consequence of a positivistic worldview is that the prior epochs, the prior wisdom traditions, are just indirectly influencing you. So you have no knowledge of the fact that they are influencing you, and so you remain unconscious in the wide sense of the word, of the past. And this is always the most pragmatic argument for studying history, is that you can be directly or indirectly aware of how much your ancestors or your institutions, your government is influencing you. If you wish to be more cognizant and to engage with them directly, then you have to go reaching into the past, become conversant with the ideas. And there's no escaping that. There's nothing that is superior to it. There's nothing that can replace it. And the consequences of the turn towards positivism, which I thought was attractive at certain points, is that it doesn't allow historical consciousness to even be present, to be discussed. Because the goal is for us, as we've said, to make it more coherent, or to create unity out of the disciplines and out of our own time. And so we can't sort of limit ourselves to anything that would be so prejudicial as to say that the domain of the unconscious, the domain of dreams, is something that we reject. This is something that we can't even navigate. We don't have the criterion to make it intelligible. And this is, I think, what keeps people away from doing analysis and even psychology, as something to them is not empirical. I think I've heard people say it's just not empirical. I'm not sure what their criterion of what empirical is, but they need to be convinced is something that is, you know, cogent and applicable to their own experience.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not an easy or straightforward task. It's almost like learning how to walk in a new way, to kind of find and figure out the proper um, clues and the proper keys that are found in our past that allow us to kind of unlock a wisdom for the future. And
Mm.
kind of looking at the fact that we're kind of approaching the end of this episode, I'd like to kind of spend a little of the remaining time to think about how this can be approached and how it can become more, you could say, guided and guided by wisdom rather than kind of tapping in the dark. And I think that's, for me, still a difficult question to answer. And it could be something that just with time, by talking about it, but also kind of refining our methods of inquiry and our means of talking about it, can become more rigorous, right?
Absolutely. For me, it's how do corresponding texts help to weave a narrative out of the history of ideas, the problems. So if I go looking to the Renaissance, or I go to the Islamic tradition to help to create sense and meaning out of these contemporary issues with religion, with politics, and with the split between science and humanities, like Max Weber talked about at the turn of the 20th century, this major split, and Wilhelm Del Tay, and what are the implications for me in my own private world and in my own existence, how I'm comporting myself through these problems of epistemology. And I think much of it has been laid out for us by way of these rigorous readers like Jung and Pauly, is that you really have a large task at your behest. You have to read essentially everything that's ever been printed. Anything between the last 5,000 years is within the domain of your inquiry. And it's discovering which piece of literature, which wisdom tradition, which thinker may have already attempted to elucidate or to disentangle a problem. And if it's in the body of literature that exists, I have to find a way to locate it. And so this makes it, I know, daunting. The how to make it approachable is you have to discover the text, or the fragment, or the piece of archaeology that will correspond to the problem you're facing and the dilemma you're facing.
Yeah. That's certainly something. I would go further and say that, like, it's not just corresponding different texts, but even reconciling contradictory texts, even reconciling how a certain age could bring about conflicting values, conflicting perspectives, and how they contribute to a bigger picture, a more complete picture of something. And that is a huge thing in alchemy that Jung talks about, the mysterium conjunctionis, the coincidence of the opposites, or in Heideggerian terms, it's like the Verwindung. And for my part, I always found it useful to look at the notion of death, because that's the one part where, the one time I remember in Being and Time, Heidegger brings up the term individuation, and that is the individuation happens at death. You are kind of entirely kind of isolated, individualized at the moment of death. And it is also the part where I find conflicting ideas to coincide. For example, in a very concrete example, I've written an essay about it lately, is the idea of how the state dies is very similar in the theories of the libertarians and the theories of the socialists. You know, they kind of conflict in a lot of other areas. You could say almost all of other areas in their, at least, analyses and kind of prescriptions. But in a way, they kind of have the same account of the kind of the death of the state. It's kind of like the death of the state is almost like the death of their ideologies. You know, if there is no state, the libertarians can't be opposing it. You know, if there is no state, the communism has been achieved. The whole idea of having a communist theory and a communist party is kind of, it's abolished itself. You know, it's kind of like they both coincide in where they reach a point of their utmost possibility where they abolish themselves. And I feel like this death is something, we have this cliche of the ego death in psychedelic culture. This death is something that is necessary for the true integration of our ideas, because what we've been talking about so far is very individualized. It's about your research and your sources you pick out, my research, my sources I pick out. What is actually the difficult part, I mean, that's difficult enough. What is actually the difficult part is how my complex jumble of ideas and sources can interface with yours in such a way that something new comes about that neither of us have predicted. And even that is only step one, because you and I are, potentially more powerful in combination, but it's still a small fragment compared to a huge kind of system and community and society of knowledge production, right?
Yes, perfectly stated. And the cross fertilization between two thinkers is a microcosm, if we want to be idealistic about it, for something larger that could be practiced between, a network, to use their terms, a community of scholars. And we've had instances of this, and there have been utopian moments in histories, like the House of Baghdad, like the Thousand Scholars in ancient China, like the exchange of letters from the world of Islam into the scholastics of the West. And there have been moments with Spinoza and Descartes and Hobbes and Bacon for them, where there have been multiple scholars from different nationalities and different religions in correspondence together, in the sense of unity and making sense out of the contemporary problems. And so there's a demand in that one has to be prepared to do the research and have time. Those are just givens. But more importantly, there has to be will. There has to be will in order to attempt to do what is called polymathy in some cases, and what is to make significant contributions to each field. That's true polymathy. I mean, that might not be something that is as tangible as it once was, to make contributions to physics, to aesthetics and philosophy, but at least to be conversant in those ideas in order to have the guiding question. Because if I have a guiding question formulated properly, then I can go seeking through a physicist, and then through a biologist, and through an aesthetician. And this is something that you have to have the inclination to do. And then practicing on a large scale would be the ideal, honestly, to have these institutes, and for them to be unified with a teleological principle. It isn't just to garner knowledge. It isn't to instrumentalize it. It isn't to technologize it. It is to preserve it and to be stewards of thought, to be poetic about it, and then allow it for there to be a place where it can actually germinate further, and then be inherited by successive generations. Because when it comes to inheriting knowledge, that's where the challenge comes in, because the houses of wisdom fall, the academies crumble, and the succession is not in the favor of great thinkers, because the Islamic golden age lasted for a very long time, arguably, right? Almost 500 years. And the succession wasn't kept well, wasn't taken properly. And so this is the ultimate problem that beyond you and I is how will it be successive? How will it be inheritable later on? This is a question of preserving the information, knowledge.
Yeah, and our most tangible will to do this is to will into existence our next episode. So I will advise everyone to tune in and stay tuned for the next upcoming episode. So far, off to a good start. I thank you very much, Dawson, for coming on, and we'll keep it going. We'll keep it going, and we'll see where it leads us. So thank you for this conversation, and I'll see all of you next time.